Okay. Okay, are we ready now? So, as I said, I must slightly apologize for this deviant one, 7a, because as I said, I try to give you a kind of way of looking forward so that you get the continuity of the lectures, but then when push comes to shove, I change my mind. So I changed my mind last night, and so that's why this gets slotted in there, and that's what I'd like to talk about. Now, as I said, the first essay talks about evil, good, bad, good, evil. The second essay talks about an independent, a more or less independent complex of notions and phenomena that also are important, Nietzsche thinks, for contemporary morality. And this is the complex of phenomena that you might call bad conscience, guilt, and related phenomena. And that's why the title of the essay, of the second essay, is Bad Conscience, Guilt, and Related Phenomena. So Nietzsche thinks this is a real phenomenon. The phenomenon of bad conscience is a real phenomenon, but what's important to understand about it is that it has a kind of characteristic structure which is very characteristic, Nietzsche thinks, for moral phenomena, in that it's a combination of a real phenomenon, that is, bad conscience is a real psychic state. It's not imaginary, it's not made up, it's not a misinterpretation. There is actually a psychic state there. It's a psychic state of pain. So there is a fact, and then there's an interpretation of that fact. So, as you remember in the first essay, we had a similar phenomenon. We had a certain physiological fact or a sociological fact. We had a set of facts, and those facts were facts, the fact that the slaves are weak, the masters are powerful. They were facts. Nietzsche thought it was, in fact, the case that the slaves were weak. And then you had an interpretation of that weakness, namely, you had two conflicting interpretations of that weakness. You had the interpretation of that weakness on the part of the masters, which is they're weak because they're weak. That's the sort of people they are. That's a certain interpretation of that state of affairs. And then you had an alternative interpretation of that state of affairs, which was the interpretation the slaves gave of that state of affairs. Namely, it's not that we're weak because we're weak. We act this way because we have chosen to act this way. So this state of affairs is a real state of affairs, but it's a real state of affairs that results from our decision to act on a certain moral conception. So in general, in the case of moral phenomena, you've got some kind of somatic or psychic fact. Morality is not just a question of beliefs. It's a question of a certain kind of set of reality, real relations of power, real relations of weakness, real relations of pain. But it's also not a simple phenomenon in which you simply have states of affairs that are psychic or somatic. It's a combination of a state of affairs and an interpretation of that state of affairs. And only the two of them together gives you the full phenomenon. And now Nietzsche says the phenomenon of bad conscience then is to be analyzed in, roughly speaking, these 4 steps. Oh, I should say that the numbers here should be 1, 2, 3, 4, not 1, 2, 3, 3. I'm sorry, I wrote this morning just for my own sake, and I didn't know that I was going to pass it out to you. So there are a number of small typographical mistakes, and 4 in general comes after 3. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, not 1, 2, 3, 3. So bad conscience is a complex phenomenon in which, 1, I have a certain state of psychic, that is, internal pain. So you don't have bad conscience if you just have a theory about something, right? Bad conscience is a form of Morsus. It's a form of biting. It's Gewissensbisse in German, the bite of conscience. There's an actual quasi-somatic, psychologically rooted reality which is there. You feel bad, and it's a reality that's both, in some sense, somatically based and internal. It's an actual state of malaise or feeling bad. Second, however, I have a certain interpretation of this feeling bad. Namely, I interpret this feeling bad as resulting from the fact that I am guilty. So I'm in a state of bad conscience when I feel bad, and I interpret that feeling bad as a result of the fact that I'm guilty. I'm guilty, therefore I feel bad. So there's a real state of my psychological, he sometimes calls it somatic, he sometimes calls it psychological. It doesn't matter. All that matters is that it's not just a theory. It has a root in the actual human being. You actually feel bad, and your interpretation of this is you feel bad because you're guilty. And now I feel guilty because I know that I've done wrong. That's why in English we speak of conscience, where the emphasis is on a state of affairs that's like consciousness, conscience. I'm aware of the fact that I've done wrong. I simply should mention that in German, of course, the connection between conscience and consciousness is less direct than it is in English, because of course it's das Gewissen for conscience and Bewusstsein for consciousness. So they're two words from completely different roots. So in English it's natural to conflate them in a certain way, to think that conscience is a question of my consciousness. And Nietzsche says, yes, conscience is a question of my consciousness, but it's not just a question of my consciousness. It's a question of my having a state of body, internal pain, and interpreting that in such a way, in a particular way, and interpreting that as the result of my being aware that I've done wrong. Okay, so that's the third component. And fourth component then is to be aware that I've done wrong is interpreted as meaning that I have exercised my free will, and in exercising my free will, I have freely done evil. So I don't have bad conscience for things that I do unintentionally. I might feel regret about them, I might feel sorry about them, but I don't have bad conscience. So bad conscience, so I might regret that I didn't save more money for my retirement 20 years ago. I might regret that, I might think it's a bad thing, but that's not bad conscience. Bad conscience is a specifically moralized phenomenon. It's not just that I'm sorry I did it, it's turned out to be a mistake, but I see that in the past I had free will. I exercised that free will not just in a mistaken way, but in an evil way. I intentionally chose something that was evil. Thereupon, I burdened myself with a certain kind of guilt, and my awareness of that guilt is what causes me now to feel bad. So that, Nietzsche claims, is the analysis of what we now know as the phenomenon of bad conscience. So, das schlechte Gewissen. And he thinks that's a central phenomenon in the in modern morality. And you're never going to understand modern morality if you don't understand this. Now, he wants to say, and I'm afraid this is a mistake too, that this complex state of affairs of bad conscience and guilt and the evil exercise of free will is neither, therefore, a universal phenomenon. It's not a universal fact, nor, so the second there, B should be nor. There should be a nor in front of B, for B. So bad conscience is neither a universal fact about all human beings. It's a particular fact that exists only if you have a particular mental, psychological, somatic state which you interpret in a certain way. It's not universal, but it's also not something that will, as it were, go away just by correcting an error. Since it's not a merely cognitive phenomenon, but rather it's an interpretation of a physical state, you can't get rid of it simply by changing, as it were, the interpretation, by not making a mistake. It's not like making a cognitive mistake, because even if you correct the cognitive mistake, the pain may still be there, right? Given that it's a combination of these two things, correcting one part of it is not necessarily going to do away with it. You're still going to have the pain. You might still have the internal discomfort. That won't naturally go away when you get rid of the interpretation. Now, Christianity, of course, Nietzsche thinks, emphasizes the priority of bad conscience over good conscience. That is, just as in the case of the slaves, evil has a certain priority over good, right? The central phenomenon is declaring them to be evil, and then derivative of that, we are not evil, therefore we're good. So evil has a centrality. So for Christianity, bad conscience has a priority over good conscience. And now you remember this famous story that's made much of in the New Testament, one of the founding documents of Christianity, the story about the Pharisee and the publican. The Pharisee and the publican both go up to the temple. The Pharisee says, I thank you, God, that I'm such a wonderful person. I pay all my debts. I pay a lot of religious tax. I keep all of your commandments. Thank you for making me so wonderful. And the publican says, I know I'm a sinner. I know I'm a sinner. I know I'm a sinner. Forgive me. I know I'm a sinner. And now you remember the Christian interpretation of this. Jesus says, and the publican, the person who, so the Pharisee is an instance of a kind of good conscience. He thinks about himself, and what does he see? He sees himself as capable of discharging all of his obligations, giving a lot of money to the poor, doing all of these things. The publican has bad conscience. He knows he's done wrong, and he knows he's done wrong repeatedly. And Jesus says, and it's the publican who is the model for moral action and moral development, not the Pharisee. So bad conscience is supposed to have a definite priority over good conscience. In fact, the Pharisee, right, to be a Pharisee is a deeply insulting sort of thought in Christianity, right? In Christianity, you're not supposed to have a sense of your goodness, a sense that you are in control of the world, you're in control of yourself, and you are a good person. You're supposed, rather, to be like the publican. So this is really important for Nietzsche. So now, the structure of this second essay that we're going to talk about now is really peculiar. And if you don't see the structure, you're just going to get very, very confused by it. Because, as I said, the structure is not linear. It's neither linear forward nor linear backward. It's a jump. The chapter starts, so we've got the phenomenon of bad conscience. And Nietzsche says that's a phenomenon in the present. The present is dominated by this Christian conception of bad conscience in some sense. This chapter, what he does is, he does not do what you might expect, start by tracing the origin of bad conscience. Rather, the beginning of the essay talks about a possible future of bad conscience. The beginning of the essay, the first couple of sections, Nietzsche talks about what would be a way in which we could overcome the bad conscience, which is the central phenomenon of our way of thinking about morality. How could we overcome that form of bad conscience as the central phenomenon in our life and turn that into something positive? So the beginning is a description of another possible future transvaluation of values. How we could in the future generate what he calls das übersittliche Individuum. How could we in the future generate an individual who was beyond conventional forms of morality and had good conscience about being beyond contemporary forms of morality. So, but that is a prediction of a possible future, or that's a prediction of a possible future that might come. He says this trans-moral individual would be the ripest fruit at the end of this historical development. So that's a description of the future. Then, having described the future, he goes back and talks about the origin of the bad conscience that we now have. So in a way, the structure is broken back. He doesn't just go back, he doesn't take analyze contemporary bad conscience and then go back. He doesn't take it and just go forward. He starts from it. He projects a possible future, and then he jumps back and talks about the origin of this phenomenon. So you've got to, and I've written that structure down as I see it at the top of page 8. So you have to think about this in that context. Now, so let's start following his analysis with the first part of this, which is how bad conscience gets transferred could conceivably be transferred into good conscience. How could that happen, and what would it look like? And now he says, you could imagine a person who had good conscience, and such a person would be a person who, as he says, would have a certain set of properties. That person would be fully autonomous, completely in control of himself and the world, and you might say that that person was a person who was capable of making promises. So the transvaluation of bad conscience is a form of conscience which is essentially characterized by what Nietzsche calls the ability to make promises. So I have good conscience. My good conscience might consist in my awareness of the fact that I was the sort of person who could make promises. And now Nietzsche says, now what does it mean to say I am the sort of person who is capable of making promises? What does it mean to make a promise? Nietzsche says to make a promise responsibly means to bind yourself for the future. So if I promise to give you £10 tomorrow, what I've done is I've asserted myself as having a commitment to something happening tomorrow. I've tacitly said, I am going to make it happen that tomorrow you get that £10. So to promise something is to express a commitment to your own power to bring a certain thing about in the future. Now, but to bring something about in the future requires two things. One, it requires you to have control over the world to some extent. If I promise to give you £10 tomorrow, what that means is I am tacitly asserting of myself that no matter what comes up, even if I've got to go and stroke the cat, even if I've got to go and buy cat food, even if I've got to do all of those external things, I'll take care of them. They won't divert me from what I'm going to do, which is giving you the £10. I'd prefer to spend it on alcohol, to spend it on cat food, to spend it on other things. But nevertheless, despite all of those temptations, those external temptations that are impinging on me, despite them, I'm strong enough to control the world. I'm strong enough to control the world and control the world in such a way that you get your £10 no matter what. Similarly, not only do I have sufficient power to control the world, I have sufficient power to control myself. That is, I have, in fact, if I promise to give you £10 tomorrow, I won't forget that I've promised to give you the £10 tomorrow. Now, Nietzsche, as you know, in this chapter, makes a big deal about that. He says, look, memory is not just a natural phenomenon. You only remember things in the context of purposive behavior. You know, to be able to remind, to be able to keep something in mind is a very high degree, requires a very high degree of human concentration. Yeah, and you remember he talks about these ways in which primitive societies try to impress things on people. If you want to make people, it used to be the case, of course, that in certain societies, the first day that a young girl menstruates, the mother smacks her, right? Now, why does the mother smack her? The mother smacks her because the pain of being smacked is so striking that it recalls to the girl that she's now a woman. So Nietzsche is very keen on this idea that you don't just remember things spontaneously. You do have a power of retaining things. But actual memory is driven by fear, pain, and such phenomena. So as he says, again and again and again, we've had to set up social institutions which enforce people to remember things. So the laws are enforced. They're enforced very brutally, and they're enforced very brutally at the beginning to remind people to keep in mind that they're not supposed to do certain things. So how is it, so what Nietzsche says is, so to promise something either just means nothing. It just means, you've said something. But if you really promise it, you only promise something responsibly if you're committed to being a certain kind of person. That is, if you know about yourself that you're sufficiently strong to resist the temptations to deviate from your promise, and you're sufficiently strong that you think you can master whatever are the external things that might come out. So promising is a way of controlling reality, he says. It's a way both of expressing your own power and of controlling reality. And of course, this is one of Nietzsche's central metaphysical ideas, right? He keeps coming back and back to the idea that the world is really a complete mess. It's a chaos. Everything is changing. And what we try to do is we try desperately to make that change into something that's stable. Our central desire as human beings is not to live in this world of complete chaos and danger and unpredictability, but to reduce that chaos and unpredictability to something predictable. And we can only do that if we have the power to do it. So he says again and again, the highest form of will to power is to stamp becoming with the stamp of being. Dem Werden den Stempel des Seins aufdrücken. You have to, and that's the central sort of thing. Okay, so Nietzsche says, so good conscience, so suppose I am this sort of person. Suppose I am this sort of person. I've got enough power so that I have the right to make promises. Now Nietzsche says, first of all, to have the right to make promises, note, is not a metaphysical property that we all have. So if you say to have free will is to have the right to make promises, I can decide to promise and I can decide not to promise. That's the alternative that I'm faced. My ability to promise or not to promise, my ability to exert my free will, is not a natural or metaphysical property that I have. It's a property I've been trained or have trained myself to have. That is, the Christian conception is free will is a metaphysical property we all have. Nietzsche says free will, deciding between one thing, deciding between another, if it's a serious decision, it will be a decision that will be connected with some kind of promise. And if it's connected with some kind of promise, you can only do that responsibly if you know you have control over yourself. But you can only have control over yourself if you've actually developed that control over yourself. You don't naturally have control over yourself. You only develop control over yourself. Or to be more exact, you only develop control over yourself if you've happened to live in a society which helps you by giving you an external structure which allows you to develop the habits of memory. So I become a strong person by virtue, so again, standard Nietzschean transformation of coercion into freedom. So Nietzsche says, in more or less Christian idea, freedom comes from freedom. Nietzsche says freedom doesn't come from freedom. Freedom comes from coercion. I become free to make a promise to you. I don't become free to make a promise to you by virtue simply of having some metaphysical thing. I become free to make a promise to you because I know about myself that I'm sufficiently self-controlled that when I see you again, I won't have forgot what I promised. How is that the case? How does it come to be the case that I know that? And now Nietzsche's claim is, I only come to have acquired the strength and self-control that are needed to engage in that kind of promising if I've been subject, and my society has been subject to millennia of coercive practices. So I know that I'll remember tomorrow to give Zev 10 pounds. I know that, I remember that, because I live in a society that has institutions. Those institutions have reinforced in me the ability to acquire sufficient control over myself and over the world so that I know that if I promise to do it, I will do it. And therefore, it's precisely the coercive phenomena that set up the society, which I internalize, and in internalizing them, they become my ability to act freely. So at a certain point, coercion turns into freedom. I become free to promise by virtue of having been forced to remember, roughly speaking. Only if I've been forced to remember and been forced in remembering to control myself am I then free actually to promise. And now Nietzsche says, so you can see that this person who is strong enough to control self, strong enough to control the world, who's capable of promising, Nietzsche says, that what that person might call his knowledge that he is in this way in control of things, his good conscience. So the good conscience that he has is the awareness not that he has been guilty of some error, but it's an awareness of the fact that he has the power to promise responsibly. And now Nietzsche suggests that that ability to promise, and to promise in such a way that you are also aware that you can fulfill the promise, that complex of things could result out of the contemporary phenomenon of bad conscience through a kind of transformation. So this is another example of these kinds of flipping transvaluations of values that you see. You can turn bad conscience, the pain that we now feel by virtue of thinking that we've done evil, into something which is its reverse, something which is good. So good conscience would be like going back to the Pharisee, glorying in the fact that he is capable of discharging his obligations. So that's the first. That's the first part of the book, basically the first 3 sections. Then he says, okay, but up to now, we can only understand how that transformation will take place. You can only understand. So I've said there will be a transformation from bad conscience to this good conscience. I've said that. But the actual mechanism of the transition isn't at all clear. That's just a black box. I've just said that it will happen. I haven't said exactly how it will happen. I've described this to some extent. I've described this to some extent. I've claimed that this can go to this, but I haven't actually shown that. I've just claimed it. So now how can we understand how it actually is supposed to happen? And there Nietzsche shifts gears and says, well, to understand how this can happen, you have to understand how this came about. So he now shifts, and instead of talking about the future, about this autonomous, self-reliant entity of the future who is capable responsibly of promising, instead of talking about the future, he now talks about how we got to the state we're in. That is, the state in which bad conscience, in the way described, is the central phenomenon. And now he talks about that. Now it's really important to see that for Nietzsche, bad conscience is, there are two, there's a primordial phenomenon. Again, there's a primordial phenomenon, and there are 2 interpretations of that primordial phenomenon. And only when you do the 2 interpretations of the primordial phenomenon do you get the full bad conscience. The primordial phenomenon is torturing yourself. That is, the primordial phenomenon is the phenomenon of aggression turned against itself. That's the central phenomenon, Nietzsche says. That's the reality. People need to turn their aggression against themselves, for whatever reason for the moment. That in itself doesn't give you full bad conscience, because that phenomenon needs to undergo 2 processes. First, a process of internalization, that is, turning my aggression against myself can take any number of forms. It can take the form of self-harm, for example. As you know, that people, when I was growing up, people didn't talk about this, but now there is this phenomenon, this kind of recognized medical phenomenon of self-harm. You know, young people cutting themselves up and inflicting pain on themselves and various sorts of things. I mean, it's one of those things, you know, there are fashionable vices. You know, I mean, there aren't just fashionable virtues, there are fashionable crimes and vices. You know, when I was growing up, there wasn't any such thing as sort of people didn't worry about child molesting. I mean, there weren't categories for these things. And self-harm also. I mean, you know, you might occasionally hear of someone who committed suicide, but you didn't have this phenomenon of a cultivated phenomenon, which was the object of intense interest, of piercing and body things, etc. So Nietzsche says, so there's directing your attention, directing your aggression against yourself. Then there's a process in which that directing your aggression against yourself becomes internalized, not externalized. I don't direct my aggression against myself by cutting myself up, but by internally generating a kind of psychic or mental pain. That's one process. And then the second process is a process in which that internalized mechanism of inflicting pain on myself becomes connected with morality. I can inflict mental pain on myself in a way that's not necessarily moral. So the full phenomenon of morality is, the full phenomenon of bad conscience is you start with a kind of mechanism of a need from whatever reason to inflict your aggression on yourself. That's internalized so that instead of cutting yourself, you have bad thoughts, or you suffer depression, or you suffer headache, you have whatever it is, and then that's connected with morality. So that's what Nietzsche then talks about. So he starts then in section 16 when he says, so the primordial phenomenon is this phenomenon which, again, remember, all of these are supposed in some sense to have a contingent origin. And the contingent origin of bad conscience then, as far as back as he goes, the contingent origin is you've got people who for one reason or another have cultivated a certain kind of aggression, and they are forced through urbanization or proto-urbanization to live in close proximity to each other. So this is an accidental beginning. You've got some kind of tribe. The tribe patrols its boundaries. You need a certain amount of space to have your goats, to have your sheep. If you don't want your neighbor's sheep to come and graze on your grazing land because the grazing land is very scarce. So you have the young men, and they're trained to go out and stay with the goats and throw rocks at the other goats that try to come in, and throw rocks particularly at the other goat herds who try to bring the goats in. So you have a group of young people who are trained in some way to be aggressive, and that aggression makes perfect sense. If you're going to die, if the goats don't get enough to eat, then you don't want the other tribe's goats eating your grass because you're going to die. That makes perfect sense there. So you have the young men go out and become aggressive in a certain way. Now Nietzsche says, what happens if you have a society in which there's this cultivation of aggression, and that society suddenly moves from being a kind of tribal society with very sparse population to a densely populated village society, where instead of having these young men, one young man every 2 kilometers throwing stones at anything that comes in, you suddenly have them all living in a tiny village. Now he says, well then what's going to happen is the need you have developed to express your aggression won't anymore be able to be operated and directed toward other people. You won't be able to act toward your neighbors when they're living in the same block of flats or the same block of mud huts. You won't be able to deal with the people who are upstairs in your mud hut in the same way you dealt with the Thebans who were coming across the border. You won't be able to do that, so there'll be a kind of there'll be a natural tendency not to know what to do with these aggressive energies. And now one thing that can happen, he says, again, this is a contingent story. One thing that can happen is that those aggressions, instead of being directed at the Thebans or whoever is the next tribe, will be turned against yourself. So you'll see the people developing forms of self-mutilation and self-torture. And so, of course, he's very keen then to talk about these examples from the Plains Indians in North America. As you know, the Plains Indians in North America had very complicated rituals of self-torture. You know, if you wanted to have people have a good opinion of yourself, you hung yourself up by hooks over a slow fire and roasted yourself for a bit, or you had yourself pulled along by horses. You put barbs in your breasts and had yourself pulled along by, and these were connected with religious phenomena of various kinds. But Nietzsche says this basic phenomenon of aggression turned against itself is the really central phenomenon behind guilt and bad conscience. Now then he says, and now this is almost certainly a mistake he makes, but an empirical mistake he makes, but I'm not going to go into that. Then he says, if you, however, go back to the most primitive form of social interaction, a form of social interaction that's in fact even prior to urbanization, what you'll find is you'll find commercial exchange. That is, he thinks commercial exchange between people is an aboriginal phenomenon. It's, as I said, he's almost certainly wrong about this. If you look at David Graeber's book, Debt, for example, Graeber has a long description about the way in which Nietzsche simply takes exchange relations in sophisticated societies and projects them back into the past. So he's almost surely wrong about this. But it doesn't matter. This is a myth. So suspend your disbelief about the empirical well-groundedness of this and just listen to the myth. And the myth is, one of the aboriginal human phenomena is the desire to exchange things. And exchanging things is subject to a basic idea of measuring things and a basic idea of justice that's connected with the exchange of equals. So there's an aboriginal, pre-social human phenomenon, which is that we measure things. He says man is the measuring animal. We measure things and we exchange things. And we try to measure what we give, and we try to measure what the other person gives, and we try to equalize that. And he says this is just a primordial phenomenon. Think of the Iliad, the famous passage where Diomedes and Glaucon meet on the field of battle, and they decide that instead of fighting, they're going to be friends. And to show that they're going to be friends, they exchange armor. And then Homer says, but Glaucon must have been really stupid. No, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say Glaucon was stupid. He says some god must have addled Glaucon's wits because he gave gold armor worth 100 oxen for brass armor worth only 9 oxen. So they decide instead of killing one another, they'll exchange, this is in book 6, the famous passage, instead of killing one another, they'll decide they're going to be guest friends, they exchange armor, and then Homer, so the first document we find in Western literature, Homer already says, look, even these Homeric warriors out on the battlefield in Troy know the value of things. They don't just, as it were, exchange things, but they know my armor is worth 9 oxen, your armor is worth 100 oxen, and therefore the guy who exchanged 100 oxen for 9 oxen must have had his brains addled in order to do this. Actually, as you know, there's another explanation for that, which shows, in fact, that that Homer is referring to something probably archaic that he doesn't understand. Because, of course, in the archaic period, you never exchanged equal gifts for each other. You always exchanged gifts with a surplus, so that there was the point of the exchange was to bind people socially to each other. And you don't bind people socially. I'm not bound to you if you give me £5 and I give you £5. I'm only bound to you if I give you £5 and you give me £10, because then I have an existing obligation to you, which I can call on later. So these primordial exchange relations actually don't depend on equality, they depend on inequality. equality, because they are actually ways of instantiating reciprocity, but you can only instantiate reciprocity over time if one of the person owes the other person more. So Homer has clearly already forgot that that's what these Homeric heroes were doing. It isn't that Glaucus had his brains addled. He was giving Diomedes more in order that Diomedes be under an obligation to him so that the next time the reciprocity could be restored. So anyway, that's all. But all of that's just irrelevant. Although I should say, if you want to understand Nietzsche, the best thing to do, apart from learning German and Greek, is read Greek literature, because the texts are just saturated with it. I mean, the best preparation for reading Nietzsche is not, I won't mention any contemporary people, is reading Homer. Okay. So Nietzsche says, certainly wrongly, but doesn't matter. Nietzsche says, so here's the primordial encounter. We want to have equality. Now, I want to give you something. We each measure. We've got a sense of measurement. And we try to exchange things that are equal in value. Now, what happens if we don't exchange things that are equal in value? Or in particular, what happens if you give me the 100 oxen and I promise to give you something the next day? I promise to give you 100 sheep the next day, and I default on my promise. What happens? Now Nietzsche says, if you can appeal to another human fact, you can make sense of what happens. Namely, just assume that all people like inflicting pain on other people. Suppose it's a natural part, not of all human societies, but of most human societies, that I get a kick out of inflicting pain on you. Then you can see how, in cases of default, it would be natural for people to try to compensate for the default by giving the person against whom the default is made the right to inflict pain on the original person. That is, so we've got X and Y, okay? And X gives Y 100 pounds, and Y is supposed to give X back. So if X and Y, if X gives 100 pounds and Y gives goods to the value of 100 pounds, that's fine. If X gives 100 pounds and Y says he'll pay the 100 pounds back the next week, and he defaults, there's no equality. And so how can we reconstitute the equality? And Nietzsche says, well, it's easy to see how you can reconstitute the equality if you think that there are different kinds of payment. There's money, there's cows, there's sheep. All of those things have value. We don't exchange sheep if they don't have value. But what else has value? The thing that has most value, in a way, is giving me the chance to torment you. That gives me real pleasure. That may give me more pleasure than having a goat. Would I prefer to have a goat, or would I prefer to smack you? It's a nice decision. So if you can assume that people get pleasure out of tormenting other people, then you can see how, if Mr. X gives Mr. Y 100 pounds, Mr. Y defaults, Mr. X is therefore out of 100 pounds, you re-establish the equality by giving Mr. X the right to inflict 100 pounds worth of pain on Mr. Y. And therefore, the equality is re-established. Mr. X gave 100 pounds, Mr. Y gave 100 pounds. The 100 pounds on the one hand was in the form of sterling. The 100 pounds on the other hand was in the form of pain. In fact, the equality is reestablished. Now Nietzsche says, now imagine a society in which these commercial institutions were in place for a long time. One of the things that will happen, he says, and this is of course a psychological hypothesis, it doesn't come from nowhere. One of the things that will happen will be that there will become associated in people's minds the idea of defaulting and the idea of suffering pain. So if this is a one-off transaction, I've just had bad luck. But if this is a continuing process over 40 years, every time, if I can give you the money back, I give you the money back. If I can't give you the money back, I get whipped. Suppose that happens to me again and again during the course of a life. Now what Nietzsche says is, it wouldn't be unusual then to think that there'd be a psychological he even uses the term psychological association of ideas. Actually, he says, Ideenverhäkelung, a twisting together of ideas. So there'll be a twisting together of the idea of being in default and being about to expect pain. So I come to you and either I can give you the money back. If I can't give you the money back, I expect to be whipped. So he says then you'll get a strong association between the notion of defaulting and suffering pain in the future. Okay? Now, however, it's a human truth that the expectation of suffering pain is itself uncomfortable. Right? It isn't the case, if I think of going home and stroking Tabitha, that's a certain kind of comfort to me. It's not as comfortable as actually stroking Tabitha, but it's a certain kind of comfort for me. But if I think I've got to go to the dentist, the thought that I've got to go to the dentist is not the same kind of pain as the pain of being with the dentist. But it doesn't follow from that the thought that I'm going to have to go to the dentist is painless. It's a different kind of pain. It's an internalized pain. It's an expectation pain. So if you have an association between physically being tormented and defaulting, and that gets itself established, then the expectation that you are going to be punished physically will itself be an internal state of discomfort. Therefore, he says, it wouldn't be surprising that the general idea of default gets associated with the general idea of an uncomfortable expectation of being punished. Right? Now, of course, this is one of those cases, as you know, as I said at the beginning, conscience and consciousness are close in English. They're different in German, Bewusstsein and Gewissen. Here, there's the opposite phenomenon. The word for debts and guilt are connected. Die Schuld is guilt. Die Schulden is debts. So here, what he's essentially saying is the origin of die Schuld, of guilt, is from the concept of Schulden, of debts. Namely, when I have a debt, a debt generates in my mind always the idea of the possibility of defaulting on that debt. Because if I have a debt, I might default on it. But having the idea that I might default on it is connected with the proleptic idea that I'm going to suffer pain. Therefore, having debts is connected with anticipating pain. Okay? So now note, this is the beginning of his explanation of how we begin to get internalized forms of pain brought into this. Now we're not in the world where the Plains Indians hang themselves up from the roof of the teepee to brown on one side and brown on the other. It's a bit like St. Lawrence. You know, St. Lawrence was the saint who was killed by being burned on a griddle cake, and he's said to have said halfway through, "I think I'm done now. You can turn me over." So it isn't the world of the Plains Indian. It's the world of the psychic discomfort of knowing that you might be in for a deep kind of a punishment, which is itself therefore a form of pain. Now, next step in the argument: how do you get from this anywhere? The answer to that, Nietzsche says, is another accidental feature. Remember, this is a contingent story. The next step is to construe the relation between the individual and social mores as a relation of debt. That is, up to now, we've had two people involved. Here I am, so I have something, Ivona has something. I try to give Ivona 2 sheep, she gives me 20 pounds, 2 people, and there's debt. Maybe I give her the money first, then she owes me the sheep. Maybe she gives me the sheep first, then I owe her the money. There. Now, that's a relation between two individual people. Now Nietzsche says, but think of the way in which individuals in certain societies think of their own relation to the society as a whole. You can think of society as a whole as your creditor. That is, you can think that you as an individual have been given something by society. Namely, you've been protected, you've been given training. Here you are in your little village. The wolves would come in and eat you up if there wasn't a wall there. The wall is put up by the village, by the ancestors. So you can construe the relation between each individual and the group as a relation of debtor and creditor. It's as if the group has given you various things, and therefore, that's just like the man giving you 100 pounds, and you owe them back something. And now what do you owe them back? What you owe them back, Nietzsche says, is conformity to traditional morality, to Sittlichkeit, right? So the group in question is a group which gives you protection, gives you nourishment, gives you all sorts of things. They are benefits. You are therefore in the relation of a debtor relative to them. They give you these benefits on condition that you follow the social rules. And you therefore are obliged to give back to them obedience to the social rules. Now Nietzsche says, but of course, if you can make that stick, then you will understand why any deviation from traditional morality will be uncomfortable for people from the whole story that has been told. Namely, because if I deviate from the traditional rules, the creditor has given me something, namely protection, on condition that I give back obedience. I haven't done that. Therefore, I've defaulted on the traditional rules. But defaulting on the traditional rules is defaulting. But defaulting, I know, is connected with having pain, is psychologically connected with having pain inflicted on me. So the state of deviating from the social rules gets psychologically associated with the discomfort, the psychic discomfort, which is the discomfort of the expectation that something bad, physically bad, might happen to you. So therefore, any form of a social deviation comes to be associated with pain. Now notice, this is as yet, this is a proto-kind of bad conscience, because what it says is people feel bad if they don't conform to the social norms. Note, this is not yet the Christianized or moralized bad conscience, because it's just a question of fear, right? Traditional Christian doctrine, of course, distinguishes very clearly between doing something or not doing something because you're afraid of something, afraid of God, right? Traditional Christian doctrine says, one thing is to do what you have to do because you're afraid of God's judgment. That's not really moral. That's just fear. Real morality means not just that you feel bad about it because you're afraid of being punished, but because you somehow have an insight into the fact that this is the wrong way to live. So notice, this whole construction has not yet become moralized. It's merely internalized. It merely says, I can explain a certain kind of discomfort that people feel when they go off the beaten track, when they depart from traditional morality. I can explain that. It has to do with the need they have to inflict pain on themselves, the connection between debtors and creditors, etc. Now, the next step, which I'll talk about next time, will try to show how that gets connected with the apparatus of morality, so that bad conscience becomes not just this internalized way of torturing yourself, but a specific way of torturing yourself that's connected with moral categories. And with that, we'll then have the full phenomenon of bad conscience. Okay, so I'll do that next time. So see those of you next time who are here next time.